Okay, the architecture building process. There are roughly 10 steps or phases to the average architecture and building process. It varies a little bit from project to project, but this is basically what it is. And we'll give an overview right now. So these are the 10 steps. Basically, there's kind of two halves, we could say. The first half is basically design, and the second half, more or less, is construction. A lot of times, design and construction is not equally split like that, but that's a decent way for people to understand it. The first step is pre-design, then followed by that is concept design. The third step is schematic design. Then the fourth is design development. And then depending on the project, the fifth step would be community board approval. So if you're doing a residential project, a home, let's say, you might have an HOA or a homeowners association.
Step 6 is basically when you start preparing for construction. So you start with construction documentation. Followed by that would be the contractor selection. Step 8 would be obtaining permitting. Mm-hmm. Step 9 is the construction and the construction administration. And the last step 10, is the staging of a home or an office, depending on the project. This, is a step that could be skipped.
Yep. I think it's important for the design portion of this entire process. I think an important idea is that design is basically a process of refinement, right? So you start with really big decisions, big gestures, big things to consider. And then after you make those decisions, the decisions become smaller and smaller, and the changes or modifications to the design become smaller as you progress throughout the process. And that's pretty straightforward, but it's important to know. Pre-design doesn't always exist for every project as an official step, but it pretty much is always there. So first, I think we have to understand that architecture and interior design, and we're kind of lumping architecture and interior design together because from our perspective, there's no legitimate separation. But both of those are the practice of creating solutions and creating solutions through building stuff, whether it be construction or furnishing. And in essence, this is a way of problem solving. And so you were responding to a set of circumstances, right? A set of conditions to achieve a certain set of goals. So there's circumstances, there's information, and then there's goals. And so the pre-design phase is basically all about understanding, researching, and comprehending what those different factors are, right? So for the information, as I was calling it, the circumstances, the givens, it would be the basic stuff like, what is your project budget? That's a big one. How much money you're willing to spend or do you want to spend or can spend? What is the schedule for this thing? What is the scope? Scope meaning how big the project is, what's involved, right? And scope is tied to another idea of which is program. And program in architecture more or less means like how the building is going to be used, right? So in a home, program would be how many bedrooms, how many bathrooms, how many living spaces, how the kinds of yards and other stuff like that. So those are the kind of the three big ones: budget, schedule, and scope. The other one with that information is the site, which is the property itself. And it's really important for architects and clients to understand the givens of the site, the characteristics of the site, both from an aesthetic and design kind of perspective, but also in terms of what you can legally build, right? There's a zoning code, there's a building code, like what can you build on this property? Those are all the givens, right? The other portion that's studied during the pre-design phase, or should be, is the client goals and the objectives, right? So this is the biggest question is like, why are you doing this project and what do you want to get out of it? And we'll talk more in another recording, I think, about why that's important and how it can be done. But that's pre-design. Pre-design is getting all that information so then therefore you can get to designing. And it's extremely important because without that information, without understanding it and having truthful and honest information and accurate information, you can't really design something meaningful or appropriate. Right. It would be like going to a doctor and the doctor assigning some kind of prescription or performing an operation without actually doing an analysis. Right. So pre-design can also be thought of as a kind of analytical phase. Right.
Yep.
The next step, which sometimes exists and sometimes doesn't, is called concept design or conceptual design. A lot of offices that we've been around have this phase, but some also don't. They kind of group together schematic design and concept design, but maybe you can give us a a description of what concept design is?
To be honest, I'm not quite sure what concept design is, because I feel like all of those kind of 3 preliminary steps of the design are oftentimes rushed and blurred into each other in most offices, especially if that office has a bunch of projects that they're cooking at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know. I would say concept design is probably the big idea of the project is, you're looking to find that before you start developing the design further.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of the spine ideas on which all of the smaller ideas are going to get attached to, right?
Yeah.
But it's not often it's not often a linear process, meaning you don't necessarily are going to find the right concept that will help you develop your design. Sometimes you just start designing and then the concept shows up. So it's not so linear, at least for the first few steps, I would say.
Yeah, I think concept design, conceptual design, design direction, design thesis, design, these are all kind of in the same ballpark of each other. And as I mentioned before, in pre-design, you're one of the things that should happen with the architect and the client is determining the goals. And there's a number of different ways we can execute those goals, but there needs to be a central idea to the project, right? And that's basically the purpose of concept design, is to try and understand what that spine that you called it, what is that thing? So like in storytelling, there might be a number of requirements for writing a novel, let's say, or a book of some sort. And in concept design, it's kind of like, what is the core concept of the book? What is the big thesis of the book?
Yeah, and sometimes the client already has an idea of what it is. Like, I don't know, let's say they're obsessed with the color blue, and the concept has to be blue, or they want the house to feel like, a tree house or something, right?
Yeah.
Like sometimes something that the client might say might be the big idea that the architect just, hooks on and just like move forward with. And some other times it takes a little bit more research. Sometimes it comes from the site itself. Like there is something about the site that's just so present that you cannot ignore it, right? Mm-hmm. Some other times, some architects might just take something much more abstract and theoretical as the concept. Really depends.
Yeah, I think the mushiness is a really good point, because for most of these steps, they're pretty squishy. So the lines between them are very blurry. And I would say out of all of these phases, the concept design phase is the most hard to define, because it varies so much. And it's the most kind of elusive and abstract in a certain way. Like, what is a concept? What does it mean to have a concept for a building, or design intent for a building? But that's basically what this phase is about. And so the deliverables that you can expect for a client are going to vary greatly, but most of the time they're fairly abstract sketches, diagrams, which are even more abstract in a certain sense, and probably some kind of writing and a lot of talking to go along with it. And there could be also like inspiration images, like you mentioned, a kind of a treehouse thing. Like a treehouse could be a concept for an entire tower. It could be for an entire city. It could be for a home. It could be for anything, right? So there might be also some reference images that kind of capture the idea without actually being very literal. But that's the point of concept design. The next phase, which is pretty much present in every single architecture building process, in any developed country, I would say this is the case, east or west, is there's schematic design. And schematic design is basically the next step of realization of the building from concept design. So it's a little more realistic, but typically schematic design documents are not, I would kind of say they're not always like realistic building drawings, if that makes sense.
No, they're kind of cartoony. They have a sense, they start having a sense of, what the different relationship between the spaces wants to be, and and the location of, this room versus that room, or even like the overall massing of what the building, shape and form would be like, right?
Massing meaning like the blocks of the building.
Yeah,
right?
I mean, if you look at the building from the outside in schematics, it's like you have a piece of mud before you do like a sculpture or ceramic, right? Before you start shaping it, it's kind of like
a fuzzy
this
outline.
very blurry and still very
schematic
piece, right? And on the inside of that piece of mud, it's really more of like like pencil lines. Like you're kind of searching for the right thing, and as you search, you draw and you refine and you erase and you try something else. So it's still very much a research phase in the sense of design. Like you're modeling in the search of the ideal scenario of the building.
Yeah, and I would say there's a lot of times back and forth between concept design and schematic. Like you have an idea, the concept design portion, right? And you start to kind of try and execute that thing. Then you realize I have to go back and shift gears and redefine what I'm trying to do.
Because the concept is so abstract that it doesn't really have shape or form in a representation way of thinking, right? Sometimes it's about words, sometimes it's about a feeling, and then you have to take that concept that's super abstract and translate it into something that people can understand and we can build. So you do have to go between these two phases back and forth to see the concept is valid and how is it valid.
Yeah, and I would say, there are times when the concept design documents will be drawings, but they'll be super abstract. Like two rectangles next to each other with an arrow between them or something. Like, what does that mean? The concept of the building is that. And the schematic design is making it a little more realistic. So probably scaling it to, the site, the property, having an understanding of what you can or cannot build. So, if I can only go up 3 stories, then I'm not going to propose something that's 8 stories tall. So we're getting a little more realistic, and it's getting to be scaled. So it's an actual, close to the actual building size-ish. But a lot of the nuances of the building design are not there yet. Absolutely. Like another way to describe it is, I think the molding clay thing is pretty good. It's also, so let's say you were to create a painting, right? Typically before you put down the final brush strokes, there's some kind of sketch on the canvas that gives you a rough outline of what could be there, right? And that's kind of schematic design. It's giving you an architectural outline of sorts of what the building may develop to be, right?
Yeah, and that's really what design is about. I feel like, maybe a lot of people don't necessarily understand what an architect does, or why not just make the thing, right? And what an architect does in all of those phases is a process of refinement and designing. Like you're looking at things at a certain pace in order to evolve in a certain direction without jumping into that direction too soon.
So in this process, there are a lot of times a fair amount of options that are being proposed by the architect to the client. So this is a very exploratory phase, right? And it depends on the offices. Sometimes offices, only do 3 at a time or whatever. There's sort of, but this is the phase when you do probably the most iterations of the quote unquote design or schematic design to see what's working, what's fitting. And I like to say at the end, and this is really, really like roughly speaking, that we could say your design is roughly 25%-ish complete in a certain way, in that by the time you get to the end of schematic design, right, you should have a direction and a building kind of schematic outline that is going to be the one you're going to work with. So another way to think about the whole process is kind of like you're building a sandcastle, and when you complete a phase, like schematic design, for example, and you move on to the next one, you really, really don't want to have to go back and then redo your schematic design phase work, right? Now, I had previously said that in concept design versus schematic design, there's a little bit of back and forth, and that's because, again, that's the most squishy part of the process. It's kind of hazy, as you said, but after schematic design, once that's done, you need to be really kind of confident in the schematic design proposal and drawings and direction that you've decided, with the architect. And that applies for all the phases. It's difficult to go backwards. It's kind of like you're carving from stone or something. You make really big cuts during schematic design, and later on you're like, oh wait, no, I don't want it to be a circle. I want it to be square. It's like, well, we kind of already lopped off a chunk of the stone, so we can restart if you want, but that's a different thing. Yeah,
the steps built up on top of each other. So that's also why it's important to split it into different steps. So, you can really think about every single thing as you move forward instead of, again, just thinking about the end result and missing all of those moments.
And this is probably a good point to highlight, a good place to highlight that these steps do exist for a reason. So even though we said these phases will vary from office to office, roughly, though, this is what it is. Like schematic design, design development, CDs, which is construction documentation, and CA, like those are the big ones that are pretty much always there, and they're there for reasons, right? The architecture and building process has evolved over the last hundreds of years to what it is now, and these are the phases we use, again, for a good reason, for design reasons, for legal reasons, to make sure everything moves forward on schedule. So in other words, what I'm saying is that this is what you can expect to see from an architect if you were to hire an architect. And if you hire an architect for a building and they just straight up don't have like some of these phases, I would be very skeptical, because you kind of need these, right, to complete these chunks of work to move forward. I mean, you can do it without, but it's maybe.
Well, it ties a lot of things. There is a lot of decisions that need to be made on a project about design and about a lot of other more technical things. So splitting the process into smaller bits allows to make sure that you ask those questions at the right time.
Yeah.
Like, you don't need to start talking about what door handle you need.
Yeah.
If you're in concept design, that's not the time for it, right? So, your structural engineer doesn't need to come on board until you actually know like what shape the building will have. It's not worth his time to be part of the previous conversation.
For most projects, yeah. Yeah, for most projects.
So,
I mean, look, again, there's exceptions to everything, but yeah, you're totally right. And that's also where the process moves from more abstract to more realistic. And that's why you couldn't expect in the earlier phases like schematic design. I mean, if you think about the word schematic anyway, it means like an abstract representation of a thing and not a realistic representation of the thing or the thing itself. So this is actually, if you understand the definition of schematic, it kind of helps paint a picture as to what this is about, right? Okay, what's after schematic design?
It would be design development.
Design development. Design development is a big one.
Oh yeah? What is it?
Well, an analogy would be like in schematic design, we have created our outline of our story, like a written outline for a paper or an essay, right? Design development is when you're taking that outline and you're making a, full sentence, long form version of the story. So you're writing the full thing out. So what that means is for architecture, there's a pretty big jump between the end of schematic design and then where we need to get to for the end of design development, right? So design development is taking your schematic design drawings and sets and deliverables, and basically you're developing them into something that's much more of a realistic building structure.
Right, and so the process is, it's still pretty much the same, except that you're going to be looking at the building and every component of the building with a lot more detail, right? Where in schematic design, things were, kind of like a very light outline. In design development, you're going to know exactly the size of the windows, the size of the walls, how big is the door, how many steps does the stair needs to have, right? And that's also the phase where your building consultants are going to be deeply involved, right? Your mechanical engineer, structural engineer, your landscape architect, everybody is going to be looking at the project with their own expertise, and then will overlay drawings on top of each other to see how each system works with each other. Yeah.
And so the other thing too is that for each of these phases, the deliverables are very clear for each phase, and the deliverables become much more realistic and technical as you move forward. But for the architect and what we do, the thinking overlaps between the phases. So even though schematic design is kind of more abstract, we are thinking ahead to design development to make sure that what we're proposing in schematic design could evolve to become what it needs to be. The same thing applies for design development. So design development, as you just said, this is when we bring on all the different consultants and we're starting to coordinate with them and stuff like that. But that's sort of in preparation for when we get to construction documentation, when things get really real, you know what I mean? So there's a little bit of this thinking forward in each of the phases. So that's where design development, we're starting to think forward about the internal guts of the building and the systems of the building.
Yeah, I mean, if you think of the size of, I don't know, ducts and beams, right? Maybe the engineer is going to go a little bit...
ducts and beams. Quack, quack.
No, but if you think of your engineers in design development, they're going to think about the beams and the ducts for your building and things like that. maybe in like a more generous sizing, right? And then all of the very refinement, tuning of every single item would be finalized in the next phase. So it's not so much schematic anymore. Like we're still talking about actual size of thing, but we're giving enough room so we know that things will work.
Yes.
Right. And in the next phase, we kind of squish everything to make it as tight as possible.
So the question is, what is the outcome of design development? What can I expect to see if I'm a client? Well, again, at the end of SD, it's more about broad gestures and kind of big brush strokes, right? By the end of design development, the design is, we would say, like 90% complete, 85% complete. It should be pretty clear what the building is going to look like, right? All the elements and components should be there. An understanding of material should be there. Even pretty specific dimensions of all the different openings, doors, windows, and architectural components. All of that should really be fairly clear by the end of design development. The reason why I say that by the end of DD, the design will be 85-90% complete-ish is because during one of the next phases, construction documentation, there are always miscellaneous smaller, in quotes, design elements that have to be worked out during that phase, and that kind of, we allot, let's say, 10 to 15% of the design happens at that point. But by the end of DD, the building is more or less designed. So there's a big jump between schematic design and end of design development.
Yeah, and the big difference between the two, design development and the construction documents, which comes a little further down, is all of those drawings are done in preparation to give them to someone to build the building, right? So it's not just an exercise of design and doing a lot of drawings. It's making sure that the person who's going to build it has enough information to know how to build the building. So I would say the big difference between design development and construction documents, for example, is the amount of drawings and the level of detail within the drawings.
Sure.
But like you say, end of DD, like we know what it's going to look like. Now the next phase, we're going to look at it at every single inch in detail and do all of the detailed drawings we need to.
Yeah. So the design development phase also lasts longer than schematic design most often. In almost every single case, design development takes a lot longer than SD because there's a lot more work to be done on our part. And in terms of like client meetings and what you could expect, and as far as the process goes, for each of these, you have a meeting. The architect will show you 1 to 3 or however many options. You sit, you talk, and then they come up with more options or refinements of those based on the meeting. And they basically keep doing that until you arrive at a set that you're happy with. And that applies for SD and it applies for DD as well. But the difference between the two phases is that when you get to design development, you're not really proposing radically new structures or completely different designs. They're more like variations on a theme, because the theme has been set during schematic design. Schematic design, you can expect to see all different kinds of crazy stuff because we're trying to explore and understand what things should be. Design development, you've chosen a path. And the path might be pretty wide, right? But you've chosen a direction. So the options that are produced during design development are more, again, like variations within a theme. If you find yourself and your client, if you find yourself saying, well, I want to backtrack and like completely redo a different thing, then you should probably recognize that you are actually questioning the work done during schematic design, which is fine. But again, there's an understanding of process, right? And the different gates you go through. So design development, a lot of work to be done there. What are some of the drawings that we can expect to see by the end of DD?
Well, if you're renovating or taking down a building, you're probably going to have like demolition plan, right?
Yeah,
if you don't, if you start from a blank slate, you won't have that. You definitely will have the elevation of your buildings, so meaning the face of the building on the outside, but also interior elevation that shows like in the room, like what the room's going to look like from the inside, right? We're going to have some pretty basic like exterior wall sections and interior wall sections to see what is the building made with. All of your consultants will have their own drawings. So your structural engineer will have his drawings, framing plans and things like that. Mechanical engineer would have like reflected ceiling plans with where the ducts and the lights are going. And, like your plumber would also have like where the pipes and how big are the pipes and stuff like that.
Yeah.
you might also have, if you're doing interior scope part of your project, like furniture plans. You
Yep.
know, where's the couch going to go? Where's the dining table going to go?
Yeah.
You are going to have some of your millwork, like custom built cabinetry.
Yeah.
You're going to have some details for that. Your materials, the materials for the outside of your building, the inside of your building, you'll start having a good list for that.
Yeah, so let me interrupt you there. So I think those last three you mentioned painted pretty clear pictures to the difference between this phase, previous ones, and future ones. So when we say materials, like we might have a sense of, okay, the interiors are going to make use of like white oak or something around that ballpark. But the specific place where you're going to get the white oak from, the exact, stain, that happens later, right? Another way to explain...
It can happen here. I mean, it depends.
The other way to put it is that for furniture, we would have a furniture layout at this point, but not the final piece selected, right? So you need the layout. You need to have a rough idea of how the furniture is going to be laid out, because the room is based on the furniture to some degree, right? They have to work with each other. But the exact fabric swatch and the exact model of the sofa or the desk or whatever it is, maybe not yet, right?
Yeah, I mean, again, you're not even done doing the drawings for your building, so we're not into furnishing yet. It's more of, the client wants a table where 12 people could sit at. We got to make sure that table would fit in the room.
Right, exactly. So that's a good example, though, of like certain things bleeding over between different phases. Mm-hmm. So like the focus of this phase is not nailing down all of that stuff, but it's, I guess, in a way, creating a developed design, a design that's developed enough so it will work when we get to that point.
Yeah.
Right. That's a lot of what the process entails.
And then you also have, after your materials, you have, like your decorative lighting, your appliances, your plumbing fixtures. Not that you're locked into which ones exactly you're going to use, mm-hmm. but if you have a gas dryer instead of an electric one, the engineer needs to make sure that, the pipes is being planned for and it fits and it makes sense where it's going to go.
And then during this phase, it's probably helpful to get some kind of cost estimate or construction cost estimate from a contractor if you can. Although a contractor is yet to be selected, if you're working with an architect who has a network or somebody, it's good to find out roughly where we're at. So that way, when we get to the contractor selection, you're not shocked by the amount. Perhaps it's too low for you. You want to spend more money.
I don't think that ever happens, really.
Oh, it happens. It happens. Yeah. It's standard of quality.
Well, then I would question your architect. It means like shop at Home Depot or something.
Yeah. But there's a threshold. There's a threshold to be.
I mean, to me, it's always better to start at a higher level and go down than starting high and trying to go up, because that's never the case.
Starting low and trying to go up. Yeah. Well, for the architecture process, we would go from design development to construction documentation, which is another level of detail to the drawings. But we insert here another phase, which would apply, especially if you're doing like a single family home in a neighborhood, which is a community board approval.
Yeah, it could be a condo board too if you're in a condominium.
Yes. Yeah, so a residential type of project, or even not. But there's various community boards with where the project is located that you might need approval from. So for homes, there's an homeowners association, which should probably sound familiar to a lot of people. And basically, what happens during this phase? Well, for these associations and these boards, they are concerned with the aesthetics of the project. They're not concerned with life safety. Life safety concerns are the building code. These folks are concerned with what the project is going to look like. So a lot of times these HOAs will have regulations or rules that dictate, your home can only have a certain kind of roof of this color. Your yard can only have so many different types of plants and this kind of stuff. And
it's more or less restrictive depending on where you are, right? Like if you're in a gated community, everything needs to look the same. So if you're trying to do like the house that's kind of atypical, that might not really work your way. I think they're just doing that to preserve the neighborhood. It's oftentimes about the neighborhood scale or like the immediate blocks around you, not so much like the city, right? It's much more smaller scale.
Yeah, it's about the neighborhood, right? And the process varies, but it's pretty straightforward. Usually there's like a neighbor approval that needs to happen. You need to get an approval signature from your next door neighbors that they're okay with what you're going to do. You make a presentation, meaning the architect or the expediter, not the client typically, make a presentation to the board and they approve the design. Now, when does the HOA approval process happen? When do we try to get approval? Basically, as soon as we have a design that's developed enough to get approval. because you don't want to develop it all the way, do your CDs and have everything done, and then realize that these people on the board are not going to approve it. Then you got to go back and redo a bunch of work, which is a waste of time and money. So as soon as you can. So a lot of times this will happen before design development is complete, before you have like the final design.
Yeah, and ideally, I think even before permitting, because if for any reason you have to change something on the outside or even on the inside of your building, you don't want to do that once you get approved for your permits, because that means you have to change that for your permits too.
Yeah. And talking about pre-design and the research, the HOA stuff would definitely be part of that. So that's one of the first questions if we're dealing with the projects.
Requirements?
We know there might be a good chance in HOA. It's like, what are the requirements? Do you know the people on the board? Because frankly, that can help you, right? Because you don't want to waste time doing stuff that ends up not working. So that's HOA stuff. And then the next thing, so agency approvals, which is getting your building permit and zoning permit, right? And CDs, like when do these two happen with each other? A little bit squishy. It's sometimes on top of each other and within each other. But we can talk about agency approvals and getting a building permit now. So what does that entail? Why would I need a building permit?
Why? Well, why not? Well, you do because there is a building code and life safety code, meaning that when you build something, you got to make sure it's gonna
be safe.
Be safe for everybody that's gonna be in it. That in case of an emergency, meaning of a fire, you're gonna be protected for a certain amount of time before the thing collapses.
And
right?
that you can get out.
Or that you can get out.
Well, if there's an earthquake, there's a lot of things.
There is a lot of things, and it varies greatly based on where the project is located. You know, New York requirements are different than San Francisco requirements.
Yeah.
They all kind of have the same baseline. Like there is, international building code that has, even across different countries, like the same level of standards. But then those standards vary slightly depending on where you are.
Yes.
Because of climate, because of the condition of the soil, because the way, the structure of the building that's being used, like you build concrete versus wood, it's not going to work the same way.
I mean, you build in San Francisco next to a fault line that's different than if you're building where there's tornadoes. You know what I mean?
No, I mean, so that makes sense. So the architect's role is to make sure that as we design the building, we keep those requirements and implement them into the building design, right? But there is a lot of them, and somebody needs to check and make sure we got it right. To some extent.
Yeah, there are some small projects where you don't need a building permit, but for any decent sized projects, and I know that's a vague term, but still for any decent sized building project, you're going to need a permit. And you need to have that before you can start any construction whatsoever. So again, similar to the HOA approval, right? You kind of want to get a permit as soon as you can because it's a necessary prerequisite. If for some reason you can't or something else, then the rest is completely moot. To apply to get a permit, you need a permit drawing set. It's a set of drawings that is specifically for getting a building permit. And the permit drawing set is different from your construction drawing set. And that's very important because this construction drawing set, as we'll talk about, is what the contractor uses to build from.
Right.
Now, and that's because the building department, they are not concerned so much with the aesthetics of the building. Roughly, they're mostly concerned with life safety. So the exact door hardware, what kind of doorknob you're using in your home or in your building, they don't really care. I mean, it has to meet certain requirements, but they don't really care, right? So there's a lot of stuff. So the permit drawing set is actually like a very small fraction of what the construction set is going to end up being. So that's also why you typically try to get a permit as soon as possible so you don't waste time developing everything else. A lot of times, if you're working on an expedited project, you will apply for a permit and at the same time advance and work on your construction documents because you have a good sense like, oh, I'm pretty sure we're going to get the permit or it's not going to change dramatically, so let's keep moving forward so we don't waste time. But there's always a little bit of calculated risk with that, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's, it's like you're writing a book. The building department doesn't need the full version of the book. They're only going to check a couple of chapters in it. If you think about it that way.
Yeah. Now,
but it's a process that could take an extreme amount of time to be reviewed. So it's something that, typically the architect would start looking into very early on to have an idea of where the project is happening, how long typically does a building department take to review this type of application. It could be weeks, it could be months, it could be years in even some cases. So it's something to really consider.
Yeah. And the last thing I would say about getting a permit is that, the building departments, they're kind of like the DMV of architecture and building.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a pretty appropriate description based on, if you've ever been through it, you know what I'm talking about. And no one outside of the people who work at those departments have any control over whether or not a building gets approved. And because of the complexity of constructing buildings, you can submit a set of drawings. And so basically what happens is you submit a set of drawings and a plan checker will review them and perform a plan check, quotes, and then send it back to you with any markups for things that need to be changed. Or if you're good to go, then you get approved. You can pretty much expect any drawing set to be kicked back at least once with some markups and some changes and some red lines. However, what I'm also saying is you could submit the same set of drawings and sometimes you would have, 4, 5, 6, 8 rounds of revisions. And other times, if it's a different person, you have 2 rounds of revisions.
It's very subjective.
So this is also why in a lot of projects, hiring an expediter whose role is to basically smooth out that process and get it done quicker might be a good idea. And an expediter, a large part of their value is knowing everybody in the local scene.
If your project, yeah, it's just schmoozing around, right? But like if your project is complex on a complex site, or you're trying to get some zoning variants and things like that, having that guy that knows his way around could be very helpful.
Yeah.
I do have to say it does happen sometimes. You get approved right away. I once did a permit set for a project in the Bronx.
Yeah.
It was approved right away.
Well, that's also because,
wow.
But you guys were also offering something back to the community, right?
Well, but also it's the Bronx, and I think no one really cared what you were building. Yeah. You know what I mean?
The Bronx.
I think it might have changed now, though.
So just if you're going through that process, just, try not to stress out. Be aware it's going to take time likely. It's not going to always be fair, but it's what it is.
And sometimes clients get worried too when they get like revisions or it wasn't approved, we have to send it back. For us, architects are quite used to that. It's totally normal. It'll be fun. You'll be approved at some point. We just have to go through like a couple rounds. And,
it sucks. It's a waste of time.
It's a waste of time. And sometimes you have to like argue and explain them because they didn't read the drawings right or the information is there, they didn't find it. So don't get pissed at your architect. It's just the process.
And don't get pissed at the people working there either because it's not going to do any good because they have all the power. It's like the people at the DMV. Okay, construction documentation. So basically, construction documents, what are construction documents and drawings?
Again, if you think about, I have this contractor I hired who's going to build my building. Imagine you're never going to talk to him at all during the construction process. You just give him drawings and he has to get it. He has to understand everything you're trying to do with the building, right? That's what construction documents are, the construction drawings. Mm-hmm. They give him everything he needs to know from at least your point of view to make the building the way you've designed it.
Yeah.
That said, the contractor has his own expertise on the techniques of how to put things together that architects don't necessarily have because it's not our background or expertise. Yep. So there is a little bit of gaps, sometimes between those drawings that we're doing and the contractor's knowledge. Mm-hmm. That's why it's important that there is a supportive conversation such as these drawings.
Yes, absolutely. The construction drawings are to convey the design intent of the building. Now, when we use the words design intent of building, it's a little confusing in a sense within this conversation because it's like, well, I thought design intent was way back during concept design. And that's true, but there's intent and then there's intent, right? The reason why we say construction drawings are meant to convey the design intent of the building is that, again, they don't prescribe the steps to constructing the building. It's not how you make the building. It's just what the building is meant to look like and what goes on the inside, of course, inside of walls and things like this.
Right. The way we draw it is we draw the final result of the building, right? The necessary steps and sequencing that the contractor will have to go through to make it happen is his expertise. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Totally. And the other thing to understand about CDs that's really important is that they are actually contractual documents. So when we get to construction, the contractor uses these things to build, right? If he builds something that's not in accordance with the design intent conveyed in these drawings, then he has to go back and fix it. Unless he did it on accident or on purpose. But it wasn't the fault of the architect, it wasn't the fault of the client, but he made a boo-boo. He has to go back and fix it, right? So the CDs are very important because they're part of the contract, and they are the pictorial portion of it. And you will refer back to them throughout the construction process for typical stuff. And also, should something happen, something goes wrong, if there's any kind of legal dispute, we refer back to the drawings to see like, no, I'm showing you what it was supposed to be. You didn't do that. So you have to go back and fix it. Or I'm showing you that I made a mistake and I need to fix it for whatever reason, things like this. So the construction documents are extremely important. The difference in terms of process between the construction documentation and design development is that during construction documentation, again, we're taking the final design in quote from DD, and now we're trying to solve all the technical things. Like what exactly goes inside of the walls? How does this detail work out? How do these two elements fasten to each other? Or how does the foundation work? All this stuff gets finessed and worked out in this phase. And this phase takes longer than all of the previous, okay? So design development was longer than SD, and construction documentation longer than DD.
And like I mentioned before, it really has to do with the amount of drawings and information that's provided during the construction drawing phase.
That's true. That's true. Yeah.
Like the general plans are going to be about the same as DD, but you're going to have more notes, more details. The actual details of things, like every single wall base will have a section drawings of it, or every single different ceilings condition you have through the building will have to be addressed. Yep. We're basically trying to plan ahead and save time, so when the building gets built, the contractor doesn't have to figure those things out on site.
Yep.
Meaning it saves time and money for the client, because it's easier to draw things in a computer and change it than just build it full scale and take it down because it wasn't thought correctly.
Yeah.
Right. So our role is to kind of look at put our special glasses on, look at the building from inside and out, and see where are the areas that we need to do a clear detail so it's not confusing for the contractor and he understands it right away.
Right. The X-ray vision glasses, right? And that's the biggest difference in a way between DD and CD, roughly speaking, is CDs were really, really invested in how all this stuff gets put together, or the composition in the end. And as you said, it's the construction documentation process is sometimes a little frustrating or strange for clients, because realistically, clients are not involved that much during CDs, because this is technical work. It's now our time to do our stuff, right? And whereas during concept design, schematic design, the client's heavily involved. Even design development, you're making decisions. We're meeting all the time. You're making decisions. I like this. I don't like that. Whatever. CDs, we don't really need your opinion on what kind of insulation we want to be using, or what kind of sheathing we're going to be using, whether or not it should be marine grade and whatnot. That's not your realm. You don't need to know about that stuff. We need to solve those things. So it's a little bit of a strange experience for clients, because it's or sensation, because it's well, it's taking a long time and I'm not seeing any progress happening. But as you said, it's important to have patience during the CD phase, because it is so much better to solve the problems, construction problems, before they ever happen, in terms of time, money, headache, everything you can possibly. It's way, way better to do it now, to spend the week to solve this thing now, rather than the month that it would take during construction to rip something apart and redo it and reorder more material, get a different person to come in to do it differently, or whatever it might be. So it's really important that everybody, including the client, spend time during CDs to do it correctly.
So construction documents, I would say, would probably represent about maybe 10% of the remaining design portion of the project. It's really looking about all of those small items that they are design elements. They're just the one that maybe the average person wouldn't take a good look at, or that you wouldn't take a selfie next to, a good base detail or a good framing detail of a door.
Take a selfie next to a reveal all day.
But they're crucial in making the project looks amazing. So
Yeah.
So that's kind of like the last decisions that needs to happen as far as the design goes, that a lot of time the architect makes the call for it because the client doesn't really care how big of the reveal it should be.
Yeah.
So that's that. As far as the deliverables,
well, the CD set is the construction documentation set of drawings is going to include architecture drawings, obviously, and drawings from all the other consultants that we had mentioned before, mechanical if they're there, electrical, plumbing, landscape architects. All that stuff gets coordinated and put into a single set. And of course, like design development during CDs, there's a heavy amount of coordination happening.
So in the construction drawing set, there is several types of documents that are included.
Yep.
Right. Once again, we have the drawings, right, which illustrate like the size and the shape and the quantity of the layouts and materials that we need for the building.
Yep.
There is schedule. Schedules can be thought as almost like a spreadsheet or a list of the other elements that we need to, kind of an inventory list, like all of the lighting fixtures that we need, all of the plumbing fixtures that we need, the finishes, stuff like that. It's kept into basically a chart that keeps track of that. And then there is the specifications, which is a bit more technical, and it gives, like the product information of like the type, the quality of the materials that we need, of the equipment that we need. So it's another type of documents that's provided in the CD set.
Yeah. And so this is, good reason why CDs are important, because when it comes time to ordering stuff or understanding how many doors and door types are in the building, you need to have this information correct, because if you're wrong and now you don't have the right door count, well, you would go back to the CD set and said, okay, either the CD set was incorrect or someone made a boo-boo and they didn't read it.
And that's basically what the contractor is going to use to price and place the order. So that's why we have to have all of those charts and stuff.
Yep, definitely. So final thing with the CDs is that you can think of it as the bridge between design and construction, right? Everything before CDs, meaning concept designs, schematic design, design development, is generally speaking more focused on design, we could say, and the construction documentation. Now we're bridging that, and we're creating something, we're bridging the gap between design and then finally construction. As it might have been mentioned, the construction document set is also used for pricing for when you're selecting a contractor, which brings us neatly to the next step, which is contractor selection.
Right. So if you already know who you want to be building your building, then you probably won't have to go through that step. If you don't know anyone, or you want to try and get the best price to build it, you might decide to do what we call a bidding process. Bidding process means that the architect often would recommend, 2, 3, even to 5 contractors to the client and be like, okay, I think you should invite these guys to basically bid on your project and see what the price comes back to, right?
Yes.
Right.
Yep.
So So you invite these guys, send them the email, send them the drawings, they accept. Sometimes even the architect coordinate like a site visit, like a walkthrough with them, if it's an existing building you're remodeling, just so they can kind of like see how much, or like what's the shape of the building.
Yep.
And then you give them like, a few weeks to basically review all of your construction documents, come back with questions, and sometimes they do, or sometimes someone sees something that's not right in the drawings, or they have a question, maybe, well, you could save some money here, this is a solution I would propose, you accept, you decline, things like that. So it's kind of open the communication during that phase, and then they have a date at which they're supposed to send their bid, and everybody sends it at the same time, to be fair, so there is no like extra time for anybody. And then the architect, what they do is that they review the bids in detail, check line by line, and see like the price difference between the different contractors and why one is higher, when one is lower, what's included, what's not included, and even sometimes interview them in person. Yeah. Just to make sure they're not total weirdos and and they've actually looked at the drawings and they didn't just come up with a price to, sometimes there is like low bidders because they do want the project, but they actually didn't look at the drawings, and later on it's not a good thing. So based on those interviews and those bids, the architect will go back to the client and advise on maybe the best 2 that, we think the client should go with.
Yeah. It would be, if you're not really, really familiar with the design and construction process, it would be really difficult for you as a standalone client to just select a contractor on your own without any input from an architect. I generally don't advise that because
it's nuts.
Because, well, I mean, think about it. If you're a client, you don't have expertise in these professions, how would you know whether or not one's better than the other? I mean, a big factor is actually going and see their work. Like, that's important, yes. But even then, are you trained to look at a building in detail to know whether or not they're good things or bad things? Like, we've seen people select a contractor because they're a recommendation. That's always the case. Oh, friend of a friend, whatever. They say they're really great. And because we're skeptical and also because this is what we do, we're like, okay, I don't really care about that. Like, let's actually talk to them and see what they've done. But we've had people select a contractor based on referral and based on seeing like a bunch of photographs of the work they did. That's not good enough. That's not the same. If that's all you can do, then that's all you can do. But a photograph versus seeing something in person is not the same thing. And a photograph of a different building type is also not the same thing. So like for what we do mostly like kind of high-end residential, like single-family home stuff, right? You get a contractor who does mostly spec work or a contractor who does a lot of like condominium stuff or for, what do you call it? Hospitality, like luxury hospitality. Like that's not the same thing as a contractor who does like custom single family homes. Not necessarily the same skill set because what's required for one is different from the other. So that's what I'm saying.
It's a matter of expertise, and it's not like, one fits all.
Yeah.
So, the same way, if your client is listening to this, the same way you're selecting your architect, you should apply that same rule to select your contractor.
Yeah.
It's a relationship. Projects can go on for construction for quite some time.
Mm-hmm.
You need to feel comfortable speaking to your contractor. You need to feel comfortable speaking with your architect. You need your architect to feel comfortable speaking with your contractor and vice versa. You need to have a good relationship from the get-go.
Mm-hmm.
Beyond the price tag that comes with your project, that's something really, really necessary. So,
otherwise, you're just asking, for a headache for the next 2 years, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 years, or whatever it might be for the process. And not only does it mean more stress for you, client, but it also means potentially an inferior product. Because for a project that lasts as long as a building, it's the process and relationships which lead to a better final building, right?
Yeah, I mean, if the guy hates you, like I can tell you he won't do a good job on your project, right? Or if he's trying to cut corners, well, it's not going to end well.
Yeah. So contractor selection, I think having an architect to advise you is the thing.
Well, that, and also, so the price comes back based on the drawings. So let's say if you're doing the selection of the contractor and you're doing it with bids and you don't have an architect, how are you going to answer the questions about the drawings? Like, who is best suited to explain them the building than the person who designed it and did all of the drawings for it?
Yeah. So our roles, kind of encompass. Well, you can listen back to the architect, what an architect does recording. But yeah, we kind of do both ends. Then finally, after you have your contractor selected and you got your permit, you've got your design, you got your CDs, you got your team. Finally, we get to constructing the building, and it's been a long process, a lot of effort to get to this point. But now the really exciting stuff happens when we break ground. We start tearing apart stuff and digging foundations. It becomes really, really real. And you better hope you have a good construction document set. Because, I have seen projects firsthand where there's a mistake during CDs. And it wasn't it was someone's fault, but it was not intentional. It was just a mistake that the architect made in the drawings. And sometimes it's minor. And fortunately, because buildings take so long to build, you have time to fix it, But sometimes people, even if you have a team of 10 and everyone's looking at different stuff, looking at the drawings, and everyone misses it, and you build the thing, it's like, well, that was not good. So anyway, construction itself, what do we do during that phase? We perform what's called construction administration.
Yeah, construction administration is probably the least fun part for an architect.
What are you talking about? I like CA. It's exciting. No? Okay.
I can put you on the spot, but I probably won't. The most exciting part for us, I think, during CA is the site visits, right? The architect will go and do site visits however often it's necessary for the project and at the phase the project is at. Like once a week, twice a week, or whatever it's needed to kind of see the progress, make sure everything's moving smoothly, make sure that at first glance there is not like a big boo-boo that was made, right? Or if the contractor has any feedbacks or anything they're not sure about or any problems that they've found, it's good for us to kind of go and see what's up. The least fun part is all of the emails that goes along with construction administration. Answering questions, sending sketches, like finding solutions. There is always stuff that shows up that needs to change because, we opened up the floor and guess what? It wasn't what we were expecting. So now we got to come up with solutions. Right?
Yeah, and the project changes. There are different levels of changes to a project. Right. And basically, I think we won't get into the technical differences between them and what they're called and the terminology just yet. But the factor that delineates one from another is whether or not it affects what's in the contract, right? So if you're changing the scope of work or the amount of work to be done, that's considered a change in the contract because the contract outlines what that should be. And that's a different type of project change. There are a lot of changes, though, that are minor changes in the work which don't affect the contract. They don't dramatically change the scope of work. It's just a little change. So I don't know, I'll make something up like this reveal needs to get shifted over by 6 inches, or it can't be that small, it needs to be thicker, or we need to choose a different metal channel for it or something. Like that's not a dramatic change. So for all of that kind of stuff, like the contractor would reach out to the architect, right? And then we would problem solve it on our end, coordinate, and then they'd, change it, make the correction or go with a different route. And for a lot of that stuff, like the client's not really even involved because there's no need for you to be bombarded with hundreds of emails about these small minutiae that, you just don't need to be involved with.
The other things we do during construction administration is review what's called shop drawings. Shop drawings are drawings that any fabricator would produce before they manufacture the piece. Mm-hmm. So, it could be, it could be a duct shop drawings that shows you exactly the size and layout of a duct that goes in your ceilings. Mm-hmm. Or it could be the cabinetry for your kitchen, and those are more detailed drawings than the ones that the architect would typically provide because they will list, how things are attached together, the exact sizing and whatever else is required, the hardware that we don't necessarily select. Yeah,
I think it's important to recognize that everything is hyper-specialized now. And that statement applies for pretty much all the industries, and it certainly applies for the construction and building and architecture industry. So our construction documents, again, they're very detailed and very important, but there's still another level of detail of drawings that has to happen for the final thing, and those are the shop drawings. So a good example is like, if we design some millwork, some built-in cabinetry for a kitchen or something, right? There's construction drawings for that we do, and then there are shop drawings which someone else does, the cabinet maker would produce. And the shop drawings have the actual specific final dimension and the exact screw types that they use to fasten things. All this stuff goes into there. We don't go to that level of detail for CDs because it's not necessary. And also, once you construct a room, let's say in that case, the final dimension of the room by the time you layer on all the stuff in the walls and whatever else will probably not be exactly what we have in our CDs. So therefore you need shop drawings to make sure, in this case, the millwork fits perfectly. So it's our job to review them for design intent to make sure that it follows what we want the building to look like.
So are we still making design decisions during CA?
That's a good question. Even though construction is primarily about constructing the thing we've already designed, there's always going to be bumps in the road. There's going to be changes, like absolutely. That's always the case. And so when you make a modification, there are not only construction implications, but design implications. So that's another reason why having an architect throughout the construction process is important, because we are wearing the hat of a construction, administration person, and those concerns, but also the hat of design. So that's probably one of the biggest mistakes that I see, is that when like a project doesn't have an architect during construction, all kinds of weird things happen and changes are made. Then you have a contractor who's not a designer, that's not his expertise, and you have a client who's probably also not an expert in designing buildings. Them two making decisions and deciding, okay, well, let's make this change. Like, I don't think it's a big deal. Then in the end, the architect comes back, or any architect looks at it and says, well, that's really weird. Why did you do that up there? It's like, well, we had to make a change and we didn't consult the right person. So again, even though construction is about construction, you should be very aware, client, that during that process, there's still design decisions that are going to be made throughout, 100%.
Right. Yeah, that's a good point. So the building is pretty much complete.
We're done already? My gosh.
It's not quite done. We call that
80-minute building. Pretty excited.
Right. We call that substantial completion. And that means that the building is safe and occupiable. Not totally finished, but finished enough that you could move in if you really had to. Yeah. Right. The next thing before the project is completely done is to do a walkthrough with the contractor and do what's called a punch list. Mm-hmm. A punch list is not when you like make a list of the people you want to punch. Okay. It's actually it's actually all the stuff that needs to be taken care of and fixed and repaired and revised before you moved in, right? Mm-hmm. So there is a dent in a door where the door needs to be replaced. There is
something not working.
A key that's not working. There is a paint that's missing on the portion of a window or something, mm-hmm. right? Like you make an extensive list, you walk through with your contractor, you're like, here, you put little stickers where everything needs to be corrected, so then they remember, right? Then they go back to fix whatever needs to be fixed. You walk again, it all looks good, and then you're done. And we do what's called the closeout, the project closeout, final walkthrough, and project closeout. Yeah,
final walkthrough. And for both developing the punch list, well, it depends, but all the times for developing the punch list and doing the final walkthrough, the client is we're all together. We're walking around to see, because that's it. This is the end.
Yeah.
We're nearing the end. And in terms of like payments and stuff, most often contractors, there will be like a
retainer.
Yeah. A certain amount that the client holds on to and then pays the contractor once like everything's done. But I would say that the architecture and building process, I guess there's kind of two aspects. There's one, you're thinking ahead all the time. Mm-hmm. So at each phase, again, you're thinking forward to the next phase and even the one after that potentially. There's a lot of internal thinking and happenings, even if for the client you don't see that. Even if during schematic design you see a nice like poetic sketch, that sketch has embedded within it thinking about design development and even CDs. And the same thing applies for all the others, right? For CDs, we're thinking ahead, we're envisioning, okay, how would they build this so we can make sure they have clearance to like install this thing? How is the waterproofing going to work? Like where are we going to source the material? We think about all that stuff. So it's planning ahead, but it's also having the right kind of like nets in place for catching problems before they become really, really big issues. So site visits during construction, that's a big part of it. We're going on site to make sure that we don't have a mistake that would disrupt the design. Or even the punch list, right? The punch list is like, okay, let's catch all the stuff that is lingering that maybe we don't see, without using our, detailed eyes as we go through the house.
Right.
So those are the two kinds of, things that are kind of applicable throughout the process, I think.
Yeah, and the last step is furnishing and decor. And as much as this is right now listed as our last step, this is a step that kind of happens concurrently with some of the previous steps we mentioned.
Yeah.
And it's done in a way that no one wants to have a house ready and no furniture yet. Like, you don't want to wait to have the key to be like, okay, now what do I need? Ideally, if you hire an architect or interior designer to work on your project, those are done in a way that when the project is about to be ready, you already received most of your furnishings. So you're really close to be able to live and move into your house, right? Yep. So, when to select your furniture?
The final section probably happens during construction because this varies, but during CDs, the architects, so in our case, like we do both architecture, interior design, and a fair amount of offices do both services. So let's say we're doing a project and we're providing both service levels, and interior design includes furnishing as well. Well, during CDs, all of our resources going to produce the construction document set and not fucking it up, right? That's it. During construction administration, though, it's not as time consuming. Typically, like the day-to-day is not as time-consuming. So we'll use that time to source and select the final furniture for the space with in consideration the different lead times. That is, lead time is how long it takes for an item to show up. Delivery, essentially.
Right, and if you think about the construction schedule, right, the timeline it takes from when you start demolition until it's complete, it's quite several months in most projects probably. Ordering a sofa could just be a few weeks, it could be a few months. So if you
now it could be half a year.
Well, now it's a different story, right? And like stock and everything. But if we do start when construction starts, it should be in pretty good shape when the project is finished. Like you should have most of your finishing.
Yeah. And this is getting a little bit into the specifics, but you try to have all your furniture show up before construction is done, so then you can stage the place. So on a larger project, typically all the furniture would arrive at a warehouse that is, that's their business. The warehouse, their business is to store stuff. And a lot of times they will actually be the ones to open up the items, check every item when it arrives, because they only have a certain amount of time to, disclaim or claim rather issues with the item. Then it's stored. And then once the project is closed, or the contractor's scope is done, he's done building all the stuff, then there's a staging. So you take all the furniture, it arrives, and then we're there on site. The architect or designer would be on site to coordinate exactly where things go and position everything.
Right.
That's quote unquote staging. The other element, though, so that's furniture items. For decor and decoration, a lot of times it's kind of difficult to choose the decor before staging is done, right? Like I think maybe some people would think, well, why don't you choose all the decoration, all the furniture at the same time? Well, it's not easy to do, because you're at that point you're having to visualize and kind of imagine and visualize everything about the home. And when it comes to decor and smaller items that are going to be curated in a very specific way, it's kind of better to have the home done, have the furniture in, so you have the set and the scene and the sunlight. You can see how everything's working, and then you fill it out with all the tiny sprinkles.
It's that, and it's also sometimes, the client has personal objects that they want to use, right? Yeah. And, those are packed away into boxes, moving boxes, and you probably just want to be there and see what they have and try and find the best spot. And it's easier to do that in person at the house, in the space, than virtually on your computer on an InDesign presentation. It just doesn't make as much sense.
Yes. Okay, great. And then it's all done. You move in and you party.
You move in, then you give us a call. We do a giant party.
So to do a quick recap, because I think it would be helpful, the phases. So the first one, we have pre-design, and basically you're gathering all of the information you need to figure out a design solution, and you're understanding what the goals are from the client, right? So if you're the client, you have to figure out why I'm doing this project. That's all pre-design stuff, and that includes researching zoning codes and HOAs if they're involved. So we have the constraints. We know all of the constraints that we're working with.
We try to gather all of the rules of the game.
The rules of the game. And then number two?
Number two is concept design, where you're going to be looking for, what is the vision? What is the big concept behind the design that's going to be developed?
Yeah, the direction.
Could be a word, it could be a sentence, it could be an image, it could be anything, right? What's going to lead the creative effort?
Right. I'm going to create this thing. I'm going to write this book. I'm going to, paint this painting. What is it? What is the direction of this thing? That's concept design. Schematic design comes after that, right? And that's where we're starting to outline the architectural form of the building, the architectural shapes of the building, to get a sense of its execution. And it's somewhere between being realistic and abstract, right?
Right.
So actually, in terms of writing, you can think of it as like an outline for your essay or for your paper, right? That's kind of what schematic design is.
Design development, we looked at everything we've drawn, but look at it in a bit more detail. We start to refine and being a bit more precise about the size of things, the different key elements. The consultants jump in and we start looking at the different building systems. It becomes a bigger team effort.
So the story that you're creating by the end of design development, it's a full, long-form story with like grammar and full words and sentences and paragraphs and chapters, all of it's in there. So by the end of DD, you can actually say that your building exists, as a three-dimensional model in conceptual space. It exists. And a lot of times people will use 3D computer modeling software. So it exists in the computer. It's there. There's your building. It's all the windows, everything's there. So that's DD, right?
And then maybe you live in a community that have an HOA or a condo board or something of some sort. You want to make sure that before you move too far forward, your neighbors and whoever lives around you is okay with what you're about to do.
Yeah.
So, you do presentation, you show them what you're thinking of doing, and then they give you their okay, and you can keep going.
And then we move on to CDs, and somewhere before or during CDs, we do agency approvals and we get a building permit. And essentially you submit a permit set, which is different from your construction document set. You submit a permit set to your building department to get a permit so you can build the thing. And it might take some time. There's going to be some markups, likely some back and forth, but then finally you get your permit, and sort of around the same ballpark time-ish, you work on finishing the construction documents. And the construction documents are, again, the documentation that bridges design and construction, and they are technical drawings. The client is a little bit less involved, takes more time than the previous phases, and that's where the architect has to be very good at wearing the technical construction hat. Right.
Then you have all of those drawings for your building. You know exactly like everything you need. You're looking for someone to build it. So you have to select your contractor.
Mm-hmm.
You can either negotiate a direct contract with them if you already have one, or you go through what we call bidding, and then the architect can help you through selecting who is the best person suited for it.
And the CDs are used for bidding. So the contractor will look at the construction documents and be like, okay, based on this is how much it's going to cost to build.
And that's usually when the price comes back, if not, if you haven't got an estimation earlier. Mm-hmm. And where maybe sometimes even like options are listed to save on different portions of the project if, we need to.
Yep. So now we got our contractor. We've selected our contractor. We got our construction documents. Now we break ground and start making the building, start construction.
Right. The architect is involved most of the time, at least on those projects, and do what's called construction administration. So we go to the site, we visit the site, we respond to any emails or questions the contractor may have. We help resolving issues that arise during construction, and then review shop drawings, submittals, and do what's called the punch list right before you move in to make sure everything looks good. Yep.
And then once the contractor's portion of work is done, which is all the built-in stuff, obviously the foundations, the insulation, the walls, the windows, any of the millwork that gets fastened to the building. Once he's done, then we move on to staging the place. So as we mentioned before, the final selection of your furniture would happen probably during construction, kind of at the same time. So the furniture is arriving while construction is happening. Then when your construction is done, you take all your furniture, which has been safely stored at a warehouse, you get that gets shipped over by those folks, and then the designer is there to stage and tell people exactly where to put all the stuff to curate it. Then the very last step would be, once that's all in place, typically, then you focus on the decoration and the decor of a house or whatever building it is, right? And then you move in.
And then you move in, and then your architect comes back and does a nice photo shoot so your project can be published all over the internet, because you got to show it, right?
And that's the process. Again, it does vary slightly, but the phases that are almost always there in any significant project are going to be schematic design, design development, construction documentation, of course, selecting a contractor, and construction administration.
And a lot of these oftentimes are referred in their abbreviated form, meaning SD, DD, CD, and CA.
Yeah.
So if you hear those, that's what it means.
That's great. Then we're done. We have a building. Should be.
Where is it?
No. So I think what we're going to do is some future recordings, some future design companion recordings.
You're making promises here. I don't like that.
We're going to dive into each of these phases a little more closely, because there's a lot to talk about with each of them for sure.
Oh, yeah. Well, we know you can talk. That's for sure.
Okay. If you like this recording, if you like what we're doing, then support the show by leaving a review on iTunes or the Apple Podcast app. That's a great way to do it. You can also find us, of course, on Spotify and YouTube. Fortunately, we can't get ratings on those platforms, but you can still subscribe on those platforms and follow us there.
We are also on the social media, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and we have a hotline. The number is 213-222-6950. You can call, goes to voicemail, leave us a message. You can text, send us a question, a recommendation, guest, topic ideas, anything you want to share with us.
Yeah, so if you had any questions from this recording and you're like, can you talk more about that or any clarifications, just text that number or email us at hello@secondstudiopod.com or again, all the social medias.
That's it. We are going to be the judge of a competition at the end of this week. So I'm very excited about this. First time doing it. So we'll let you know how that goes. I think it should be pretty interesting.
And we have some really cool guests coming up. And we just really appreciate that all of you are listening. It means a lot to us.
Yeah. And we read every single review. So thanks again to anyone who left us a review.
Yeah, very cool.
Only the good ones.
Okay. All right, everybody. This is the Second Studio. Thanks again for listening, and we will talk to you again next week or sooner. Bye.
Bye-bye.